think we could start, okay? Is that all right?
Yep.
Okay. So welcome everyone. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your evening to listen to the inaugural event this year for the Humankind series. My name is Mike Nagel, and I teach history and political science here at West Shore. And we really appreciate the fact that you're here at this presentation to hear Dr. Alan Gallay. So if you're not familiar with it, the Humankind series is in its fourth year. And we're doing things a little differently this year because of the pandemic, as you can tell. All of our events will be presented by Zoom, at least for the fall, probably the winter too. Each year, Humankind explores the question of what it means to be human. And our goal is to address life in different regions of the world. Last year, our region of focus was Cuba. And this year, it's the British Isles. So how did we come up with these different regions? Well, we ask students, we ask the community, we also ask staff and employees, and they came up with these different areas. And so that's why this year we've got the British Isles. So just looking forward, next week on Tuesday evening at 7:00 p.m., artist Philip Hartigan will speak about his work. So you can tune in next week for more of the Humankind series, and there will be subsequent events as well. For more information about Humankind, you can access our website at humankindwscc.org. That's humankindwscc.org. So today's speaker is Alan Gallay. He holds the Lyndon B. Johnson Chair in American History at Texas Christian University. He's the author of several books, including The Indian Slave Trade, which won the prestigious Bancroft Prize. Previously, Dr. Gallay taught at The Ohio State University in Columbus and Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington. Now that's where our paths crossed once before. I was a student at Western Washington University, and I ended up taking, as a graduate student, I took 2 of Dr. Gallay's classes, but that wasn't my first interaction with him or the first time I noticed him. So we would go to the gym when we were freshmen and sophomores, and there was a unique basketball player who was always on the court. He wasn't real tall. He had long hair and a bushy beard. It turns out it was a member of the history faculty. It was Dr. Gallay. You play basketball anymore?
No, I don't. Once I couldn't dunk anymore, that was it, you know.
Okay, all right. So not only is he an excellent researcher and writer, he was a great teacher. So today, Dr. Gallay will talk about his most recent book, Sir Walter Raleigh, Architect of Empire. And as far as the format of this presentation goes, I plan to ask Dr. Gallay several questions, and a series of questions. But if you have a question, please use the Q&A format from the webinar, and feel free to use that to offer your own question. So, welcome, Alan. It's great to see you.
Thank you, Mike. It's great being here. Look forward to talking with everybody.
All right. So, can you tell us a little bit about Sir Walter Raleigh?
I don't know if I could tell a little bit. Now, I could tell a lot because Walter Raleigh did so many things and was involved in so many things. It's hard to put him down and just, to talk about him just for a minute. He was an impressively talented individual who knew a lot of famous people and did a lot of things in different areas of life. And in that regard, he epitomized the Renaissance man. This is the English Renaissance. And the Renaissance idealized people who were polymaths, who would have talents in many different areas, and actually to try and connect different aspects of existence. So they didn't separate religion and science, for instance. They looked at those two things as being as part of life, as part of humanity, both of those things. So I could just give you a list. I'll try not to do this too quickly, of the kinds of things he did and was involved in. So on the one hand, he had his physical activities. He was a captain of sailing ships, a pirate, a diplomat, a soldier, an explorer, a colonizer. He ran the tin mines in southwestern England. He also had the monopoly over wine licenses for all taverns, including at the universities in England. Additionally, he was a poet. He becomes a famous historian, an ethnographer of native peoples. He was renowned for his pamphlets that he wrote about naval strategy. He's the first great naval strategist of England, and influences English naval strategy for centuries. He even wrote about things like child rearing. He wrote about marriages. Uh, so he had all these different interests, including he was a leading man of fashion. Can we see picture 4 for a second?
Sure.
He set, this is one of the fashions he set at the court. Women used to wear these, but he made it so that men could wear them. And you can see it's like a head on a plate, and it's lace around the collar. And he also wore earrings like a man of the sea does, and he wore jewels on his feet. So he's very visually oriented, a maven of fashion, and a lot of people didn't like this because it led other people people to having to get dressed up like he did and spend money on clothing like he did.
Say, Renee, can you double click on it maybe? Because I don't think it's not as big on my screen.
Oh, okay. Is that better?
Well, I guess maybe that's what it'll be. I don't know what you can see. It's if I move. Okay, sorry to interrupt.
Right. Let's go to picture 1 now. Another picture of him much later in life. And here you can see he's a grizzled older figure. This is after the Battle of Cadiz in 1598. He's in his late 40s. We don't know exactly how old he was. They didn't used to always record births back then. He was born around 1553 to 55. You can see the cane in his right hand, which is illustrative of the wound he got at Cadiz, Spain. The English, actually led by Raleigh, took the city, held it for ransom. Everybody got a lot of plaudits for it, but they didn't bring back a lot of money, which really irritated the Queen. She always liked military events to pay off, and this one didn't pay off that much financially. And in the back of the picture, on the left side of the picture, you can see that is a picture of the Battle of Cadiz. It doesn't show up really well, I see. So you can see he's a man of thought and action. He's emotional. He epitomizes in many ways the Renaissance, not just by his activities, by how strongly he felt for things. In the Renaissance, it was okay for people to wear their heart on their sleeves, to be emotional. Their music, their dancing were over the top, above board. And so he sort of fits in or he does fit in with that style culturally. It made it so that he was both widely admired and the most hated man in England for a long period of time because he was such a success. He's not a noble, he's a common man, and he rises to the top in English society as the favorite of Queen Elizabeth. And as the favorite, she gives him lots of rewards, including he becomes a colonizer for England. He becomes the leading colonizer for North America, South America, and Ireland.
Wow.
So with all of these accomplishments and everything, I can see why people in general would be interested. But what made you want to study his life and to spend many years studying him and then producing this work?
One thing I knew he was so interesting, it would keep my interest for a long time. I'm a student of colonialism, and that's what I was interested in undergraduate and graduate school. And I came across this man who established the first English colony in what's today the United States. And I found it fascinating that both people in his time and historians spoke about him as being just in so many different ways, as being that hated man, as being someone who was so talented and loved. And I thought, if I could figure out why he's so divisive among people and their opinions, it actually might help me figure out the origins of colonialism. In other words, the root of the United States as a society, because he's the first to try English colonization, and he sets a lot of the precedents for what's going to come. And I knew I wasn't ready at the time. This is many years ago. And I wanted to write about the American Southeast first. I wrote some books about the South. And as I was finishing one of those up, I thought, I think I'm ready to try Raleigh. Because I really had to learn a whole lots of new things. I'll just give you a couple examples. I had to learn about art and poetry. And I had to learn a lot about the King Arthurian tales, King Arthur, because he and the people at the court, they sort of perceived the world in many ways through King Arthur's tales. They would play act the tales. And so there were so many different things I had to learn. I had to retool as an historian, studying the plays like Shakespeare and so on that were written at the time, so I could try to figure out him and the origins of colonialism.
Oh, that's great. So, well, if I can follow up on that, how much time did you have to spend in England in order to do research?
I did several trips. In fact, I was teaching in England. I taught there a couple times, and I lived down the street from the British Library, which is their version of the Library of Congress. So I could go order documents to look at, come back and have breakfast, go teach a class, and then go back and the documents would be ready for me. And I did that for 2 semesters, 2 different years. And then I took some other trips there where I would stay for 3 weeks and more at a time. What surprised me, though, was I didn't expect I was going to have to do so much research in Ireland. I thought I'd already done a lot in Scotland for the previous project. In Ireland, I thought, well, I'll just do a chapter on his work in Ireland. And it turned out once I got there, I went for a couple of months to Dublin to work. I was astonished at how much information there was about him. And I began to realize, oh, this is the center of the book. That at the same time he's colonizing Ireland, he's colonizing America, North America, and he's planning South America as well. But what was important to England at the time was Ireland. Ireland was most important because of strategic purposes. They wanted to colonize in America, and there were wonderful things that they hoped for. But England feared, for one thing, England feared that Spain would use Ireland as a place to conquer England. And so the English realized they had to secure themselves in Ireland to keep the Spanish out. And Spain was England's greatest threat. It actually did try to conquer England on a couple occasions, a few occasions, and Raleigh was involved in all of them to some degree. So it was a real threat. And, you know, at one point with America, basically, he had to put down colonization to just focus on England. That's what the Queen and the government needed. And he had spent a lot of time there.
Now, you've mentioned Elizabeth a couple of times. Raleigh had a unique and sometimes stormy relationship with his queen. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, they were 2 headstrong people. She was much older than him, you know, close to 20 years being older, but she was infatuated with him. She liked young men, and he was handsome and dashing and smart. And she liked all those three things: dashing and smart. And he entertained her. He stimulated her intellectually. She was a great intellect herself. And he stimulated her. They could talk about anything under the sun: history, poetry. They both loved the French language. They could talk about religion, and they could talk about practical matters. And he would get out his lute and play music for her to poems that he had written. And they wrote poems to each other. And in fact, the poems could be read at court, and they were political statements, these poems, even though they were about love. They were very much political statements about where Raleigh stood in the Queen's heart, for instance. So there are ways to elevate his status. And in fact, poetry was being used because of Raleigh. Many people, dozens of people, started writing poetry to the Queen to try and raise themselves in her estimation. And she couldn't take just any old poem. And what's, you know, amazing to me is that the salty dogs of the time, the famous sea captains and pirates like Sir Francis Drake, Martin Frobisher, almost all of them wrote poems to the Queen. And so it also showed to the Queen that they had this other tender side. And she liked that. You know, she liked her men to be virile and really almost violent, and at the same time to show a soft side, that they know when to be one way and when to be the other. And they often clashed heads over policies, over, you know, a variety of things. She was a very spirited individual, and she's the Queen, you know, so she gets what she wants, but sometimes her men would, you know, speak back to her, which irritated the heck out of her. Although what really irritated her was when the military men would not follow directions, because she's in charge of the military, and she was constantly getting disregarded. So that was the thing that irritated her the most.
So during this era is actually called the Elizabethan Age, okay? And a cult of Elizabeth emerged. Could you talk about that? This cult of Elizabeth?
Sure. In fact, we could put up picture 5. It's not, she's not the most darling looking in this picture. Usually they give you younger pictures, but I like this one because she's sitting on top of the world, basically. And yeah, that's the Ditchley picture. It's actually in Siena, Italy. Also, I just forgot the question.
The cult of Elizabeth.
Oh, sorry, the cult of Elizabeth. In England, her advisors wanted her to be worshipped. There was some question about her legitimacy as the monarch. And so they wound up creating a cult around her and celebrating her, in a sense, as being the new Virgin Mary. That she was pure, she was a virgin, that she should be worshipped. England had discarded the Catholic Church. And so they had discarded the Virgin as someone to be worshipped, and yet people still wanted to worship a female figure. And so they built this cult around her, and Raleigh played a great role in that. He taught other people at court and in England how to worship her. He made her into a goddess. In fact, he made her into basically 5 different goddesses. So you could write poetry about her as one of these goddesses. And she loved it. You know, she loved the adoration. And again, you had to, those poems better be darn smart or she's not going to be interested. But she loved being adored by people. She was in love with the concept of love. And she couldn't marry. As far as she was concerned, she didn't want to marry because she felt she'd have to give up her power to whoever she married as a male. And so she never got married, although it was proposed many times. And she looked at Raleigh as the person she was going to grow old with. You know, here's this fellow who she could give a lot of jobs to go do, whether it was diplomatic or military or to colonize in Ireland. And he was one of the leading advisors to the government on Ireland because he'd been a captain there. But he will fail her in that regard, and we'll get to that later.
Well, it's almost as if she used this issue of herself and the potential of marriage as a diplomatic ploy.
Oh, she certainly did. Yes, with many different people. And historians do, Michael, the historians do argue about that. When did she stop using it as a ploy, or when did she start using it? You know, because when she's younger, she probably was interested in the beginning. But the negotiations always failed. She always, in the end, resisted the choices for her. There was always the problem of, does she marry a non-English person or English? But then eventually, like you were saying, it was really questions of diplomacy.
And so we don't have any questions yet, but I just want to remind people who are here, please feel free to offer a question. And I stuck my foot in my mouth at the beginning of this presentation. I didn't introduce Renee Snodgrass.
Oh.
She's the host for the.
Hi, Renee.
Hi.
I am so sorry, Renee. But she is here. She is our Director of Library Services. She's making it all happen.
I'm just running the slide projector, the virtual slide projector.
So far we found out that he's kind of this Renaissance man with all sorts of interests. We've touched a little bit on his relationship with the Queen, and you've mentioned something about his colonization. Could you tell us a bit about his involvement with Roanoke?
Sure. Colonization, only the Queen, only the monarch could decide who's going to go overseas to colonize. People just weren't allowed to go do it. In Spain, they did. Conquistadors often just went abroad, but the king tries to maintain control over these people, but has difficulty. In England, and this is true, with the other colonies, all the colonies that develop, the colonies belong to the Queen. They don't belong to England. So she has 100% control over who colonizes and over the colonies. By the way, just going to the American Revolution, when Americans complained about no taxation without representation, they were theoretically right, that they're not under Parliament. They're under the monarch. So anyway, the first person to get right to go colonize was Raleigh's elder half-brother, Sir Humphrey Gilbert. He will go to Newfoundland. His other attempts fail. He dies in the process. And after he dies, Raleigh goes to her and says, how about me? And she gives him the monopoly, the sole right to colonize in America anywhere he wants, as long as there's not another European power nearby. And so he could actually, if he wanted to, colonize the entire coast from all the way up near the Arctic, all the way to Florida. And all he had to do was to set colonists in different places, and he would control, I think it's 600 miles within whatever he planted. But it was a difficult thing to do because the Spanish are about, and they don't want the English to colonize. Anyway, so he does a lot of great planning to send expeditions. He's going to send early expeditions with people to figure out what can we do in America. He knows there's not going to be gold and silver. There's no reports of it in what's the United States East Coast. And he comes up with, we're going to look for ways to make money, to produce things, or to trade with Indians for things that England needs. And so he sends exploratory expeditions to figure out where to settle and what to do. What kinds of colonists do I send even? He has no idea. Do I send farmers? Do I send workmen to, who do I send and how many people? So he sends some expeditions over. And let's put up a picture. Where am I? Picture number 12. And so we can't get that bigger though on ours.
Yep, it just depends on where you'd like it on.
Oh, right in the middle,
Okay.
Yeah, let's. So he sends an artist to paint or to draw pictures and ultimately to paint pictures of the native peoples, because they don't know anything about the native peoples, of the landscape. And it's interesting, this artist never once does a picture of an Englishman in America. They're only interested in the native peoples. And he has this artist work with Thomas Harriot, England's foremost scientist. Raleigh sends to America also to figure out what are we going to do with America. It was sort of like sending Stephen Hawking to the moon. The moon is a good analogy for this area. In fact, on all Raleigh's trips to America, there were a lot of people in England who never believed he left. It seemed too far-fetched to be going to America to build colonies and an empire. And this was throughout his life. And so he constantly would have his people bring natives back as evidence that they had been to America. And Raleigh will befriend these people. So this is a picture of one of the villages that they went to, and it's showing a composite of natives engaged in different activities. You could see they're dancing out front. In fact, we could blow up a different picture of the dance, number 11. And I find this picture very interesting because what the artist is doing is he's showing the natives, he's trying to freeze frame so you could see their steps from one to the next. And he's trying to show their ubiquitous activities. This was dancing, which they did a lot of, but also he shows them eating even, sitting down to eat, how they cook their food. He shows how they care for their children, carry their children. It's a lot of just daily activities, and he's going to have these published. But first, well, I'll give you an example of the publication of a page, number 14. Especially since we don't have the original of this picture, whereas we have the originals of others. These will be published in 4 languages: English, French, Latin, and German, and they're sold throughout Europe. This is the first of what becomes 30 volumes, basically, on the New World, published by the de Bry family over about a 30, 40-year period. Thomas Jefferson's going to purchase these volumes as the start of the Library of Congress. There will also be 20 additional volumes on Asia. And these pictures become the most influential pictures made of Native Americans until the invention of the camera. They're that important. And this first volume's on Virginia, and it's showing the native activities. Here they are using fire, because they don't have iron axes, to hollow out these big paragua trees that are often 60, 80 feet long that make these huge boats for them to travel on, especially in the river system. And what the painter's also showing, and these descriptions provide, is information about how ingenious the natives are. So if we, here you see them using fire to build the canoe. If we go to number 15, we can see the natives fishing. And the correspondence we have from Roanoke, the people are amazed with the fishing. And I'm sorry, you can see the weirs over on the left in the middle that they build. Their use of fire inside the paragua here, that's for night fishing to attract the fish so they can spear them right next to the canoe. And you can see other pictures of them spearing as well. And in fact, the English on their second trip to America are going to starve because they have a falling out with the Indians pretty much, and the Indians refuse to feed them anymore. And the leader, Ralph Lane, says, we just don't know how to catch the fish here. If they don't repair our fish weirs, we are going to die. And they didn't know how to produce food there yet. They don't even know really how to hunt in this environment. So they're dependent on the natives. They're very much dependent. But what I wanted to point out about these pictures and showing native ingenuity is that Raleigh believed, like many other intellectuals, that the Indians were blessed by God. And that one thing about going to America was that the Europeans were going to learn so much from the native people. They want to get rich. They want to get gold, or they want to get things that they normally have to import from Asia, like silk. Almost every colony, by the way, the first thing they do is try to produce silk. So what these idealists believe is that the Indians don't have Christianity, but it's obvious that God has blessed them. So God has introduced these peoples to Europe at this moment in time because he has a plan that they learn from the native people. And Raleigh's ideal of colonialization at this point is we need to all get along. And it's not clear that they're going to assimilate together or just live next door to each other at this point, but that they're going to live in peace and harmony and share with each other their knowledge. Raleigh and other Europeans are especially interested in medicine. They're especially interested in plants used for medicine and for methods of curing. In fact, if you go to the British Library and you look at the correspondence of American colonists in the 17th and 18th centuries, the largest collection you will find of private correspondence has to do with medicine. People in Europe want to find out, how do we heal with American plants? And they're constantly, looking for the plants in America. They're looking for how to heal. And it's just amazing how focused people are in Europe on the healing. And Raleigh at this point is focused himself. I didn't mention he works in a laboratory. He and his brothers were all interested in alchemy and chemistry. And he's going to become world famous, or at least in Europe. He's famous throughout Europe for his medicines, which he produces and becomes most famous for when he's actually in prison producing medicines. So my point here is that even from the start, he's really interested in native people. And they come back, they're brought back with their permission. They become friends with Raleigh. He develops lifelong friendships with several Indians. I mentioned him being in prison. We'll come back to prison, but um, two of the natives live outside the prison and have permission to visit him every day for years, basically for a decade, and keep him company and help him with his experiments and so on. So he's known for these relationships that he develops.
So Raleigh establishes the Roanoke Colony, or he has it established in the 1580s, and so it's more than one expedition that's involved, and then it eventually becomes the so-called Lost Colony, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, but could you talk a little bit about that early interaction? Then eventually, there's some conflict, and then we find out where we wonder what happened to them. Could you address that?
Sure. So he has three major expeditions go to Roanoke, and there's his cousin and other people, cousin George Grenville and others are bringing supply ships, and they show up as well. But three major expeditions. The first was only for 2 months to check things out and find a place to colonize. And they come back and report to Raleigh, and he creates the second expedition, which has this painter, John White, and Harriet, and they're there for 10 months. And they're exploring, and while Harriet and White are off exploring, the governor develops terrible relations with the local natives. He's a captain like Raleigh from Ireland, but he's not interested in native peoples. Raleigh's cousin, George Grenville, also is not really interested in native peoples. They sort of ruin the relationship with the local natives, the breakdown that occurs, and it forces the English to abandon Roanoke. Sir Francis Drake comes along, brings 100 Africans and Native Americans to become colonists. People don't even realize that Drake had long before established relationships with Africans who had been slaves of the Spanish in Central America. And he while Raleigh's building this, has the second expedition building the colony, putting up a fort, for instance, Drake was off raiding the Spanish West Indies and liberating these Native Americans and Africans, and he brings them to be colonists. Basically, as free people, they become a lost colony. They're actually the second lost colony. This first one is soldiers were left at Roanoke, they disappear. There's also these 100 Africans and natives, which we don't know what happened to them, although I speculate in the book what happens. And then the third one is after the terrible second expedition, fell apart, Raleigh tries again, but they decide to go to what today is the Chesapeake Bay, where modern day Virginia is, but they stop at Roanoke to pick up the soldiers that had been left there that have now disappeared. And when they see that they're not there, the captain who brought the colonists, and these are families, they're going to be real colonists, he leaves them there because he wants to go off pirating. And, the seasons are changing. He's got to do this before the hurricane season comes. And so they're stuck there. The governor is John White. Because relations turned so bad, Raleigh said, I'm not going to make another soldier governor. He made the painter governor, which is like unprecedented in colonial history, to pick a painter to be governor. But he knows the people. He made all these sympathetic portraits of them and, pictures of their life. And the people said, when the captain abandoned them at Roanoke, he said, John, would you go back to Raleigh, tell him what happened, get us another ship so we can move to the Chesapeake. He goes home, and he can't come back because Spain has sent the Armada to conquer England. And so that puts everything on hold. And he is finally given a ship to go, but he's captured before he gets there. So now he's imprisoned, he's released, he comes back, and now the years are passing by. And Raleigh has already moved on to Ireland to start colonizing there. And eventually, John White returns. His daughter and son-in-law and his grandchild are there, Virginia Dare, who was born at Roanoke, the first English child born in America. And everybody's gone. And that's the famous lost colony, which every year or two you see new news items coming up. Somebody's figured out what really happened to them. And we still haven't figured it out. There's theories, but we don't have anything definitive on what happened. But as I mentioned, he's already moved on. He's moved on to Ireland.
So there was a question about Virginia Dare, so
Oh.
you got it. So yes, so that's.
And then the follow-up to that was, is that why we have a state named Virginia?
Oh.
Yes. So Virginia, which was North Carolina at this time, was named by Raleigh. He gave it the name for the Virgin Queen. So it was named for the Queen, Virginia. And it meant that whole area. It wasn't until later that Virginia was actually separated from what was North Carolina. In fact, North Carolina was just called Carolina. That had to be separated from South Carolina. So, so that's where Virginia, the first permanent English colony, comes from.
And then we actually had a question going back a little bit before that. Sure. This person is interested in the connection that you made between colonization in Ireland and colonization in North America. I'm wondering about how Raleigh and his contemporaries viewed the Irish in comparison to indigenous peoples in the Americas. For example, using similar words and phrases to label and thereby better control perceptions of both groups.
That's true. For instance, the use of savages is a particular label that was used for the Irish and for Native peoples. And I would say, and I go into this in the book, that it's the English experience of Ireland that shapes the English experience in North America with Native peoples. There's a whole array of things. Keep in mind that England's been in Ireland for 400 years at this point. And they've sent people over in a variety of ways, but they haven't undertaken modern colonization like they're going to do under Elizabeth. But they have many English there. They're actually called the Old English. Over those 400 years, the English developed ideas of the Irish that, and I'll give you a few examples, and then you could see how it carries over to America. Because they look at the Irish as a native people. And one of the consistencies is when the English move to Ireland, they become Irish. They adapt the culture of the Irish, the language, the dress. They will sometimes maintain the English tongue as well. Well, English people for centuries were pulling their hair out when English became Irish. So what the English did was a couple things. One was they built what we call the Pale, P-A-L-E, and it's a series of dikes around Dublin to keep the English in and to keep the Irish out, to keep them separated. And this is where we get the term beyond the pale of civilization. And pales would later be built in Russia and in other parts of East Europe to separate different ethnic groups. So beginning in 1366, I think it is, a series of laws were passed to stop English from becoming Irish. And this is directly going to be related to America. That the English were barred in Ireland from wearing Irish clothing, from riding horses in an Irish style, from taking Irish names, from speaking the Irish language, in essence, from becoming culturally Irish. They're trying to prevent their people from becoming Irish. The same thing happens in America. The English colonies will work diligently to stop their people from dressing like Indians, from wearing their hair like Indians. Hair is another thing. In fact, if you could put up picture 2, we can see a early modern Renaissance era picture of Irish and Scots actually soldiers in Ireland, and they have very different dresses. As you can see, these are soldiers, so they're carrying weaponry. So they don't want their people dressing like Irish, using Irish style weapons. I said, even, like I said, riding a horse in the Irish style. So they do the same thing with where Native Americans are concerned. They don't want, the English don't want their people becoming Indian. And so they pass laws to stop them from doing so. So I think it's the culture of, we have to stop our people from losing their English culture that is common between Ireland and North America, and that the English learned this in Ireland, and that's what's carried to North America.
Right. Well, as you say that the English have been in Ireland for quite some time, could you talk about Raleigh's actions and his involvement there?
Yes, because Raleigh, by the way, is not afraid culturally of Irish or natives. So he's different than, people in the mainstream here, but there are other people like him. And he doesn't want natives or Irish to be exploited. And neither do his allies. Colonization to Raleigh is very idealistic. And it gets to such an extent that he writes state papers for the Queen, telling her he agrees she should build an empire, but an empire without conquest. In fact, and one of Raleigh's people even writes a poem about the empire without conquest. So it's kind of, it becomes a common motif or trope about how colonization should be, but Raleigh's serious about this. That he says, you know what? We are not the chosen people, the English. The Indians are blessed. We can learn from them. It's their land. Just like Ireland is Irish land. The land they're planning on colonizing was land taken away by traders, because if you commit treason, you lose your land. And it was treason against the Queen. And I'm not saying it was just taking away the land, but I mean, that was the rationale. So when he goes to colonize Ireland, then we could put up picture 21. And this is Southern Ireland. It's or a portion of Southern Ireland that we're focusing on here. And it's sort of between Cork and Waterford, if you know the Irish coast over there. He wants to work with the Irish. So he makes a lot of arrangements with local Irish. So he's not necessarily removing them from their lands. He owns the lands. He owns 78 large estates here. It's about 225 square miles. He even owns the river. But he works with Irish families. So he is, trying to make, as he did in America, a society where the natives and the colonizers benefit one another. And he works to end persecution of Irish. Even before he actually setting up the colony, he knows he's going to be able to do this, but he works to end persecution for Irish regarding the earlier rebellions, regarding their practice of Catholicism. He's very much interested in religious tolerance, and he will write at length about the need for religious tolerance in his last book, The History of the World, which he writes in prison. So he's very open-minded to other cultures. And again, he tells the Queen, this should not be an empire of conquest where we go. We should work with people. They should be allies with England under the Queen. So, and he goes into details on what this would mean. And he says, for instance, we shouldn't change the native people's culture. There's nothing wrong with their cultures. He says we shouldn't even send missionaries to them. In the beginning, he thought missionaries were a good idea, but he develops the idea, don't send missionaries. It's their religion. There's nothing wrong with it. And he goes into detail why. And he says if they want to convert to Christianity, they'll ask for missionaries. And instead, he says, let's teach them how to build European weaponry. We'll teach them European tactics so they can defend themselves against the Spanish. And we should ally with Indians, for instance, throughout the Americas to kick the Spanish out because they're enslaving the Indians, they're killing the Indians, they're exploiting them otherwise. So that's his grand plan, is a massive alliance where the empire is going to be an empire of countries that are equal with one another under the queen.
You know, you spend a lot of time on this idea of colonization and conquest as well as the co-creation of things. Do you think he was naive in hoping this? Because if they're working together but they're under the queen, there could be resentment and that. So, how would you address that?
I think there's probably some naivete here. But it is interesting how quickly he worked on things to amend the situation. Like when the violence broke out at Roanoke, I make, the painter the governor. And in South America, he keeps up with his papers, not just to the queen, but to her advisors. This cannot be about conquest. This can't be about conquest. But, he couldn't foresee what was going to happen, of course. But he is a skeptic about human nature. He's actually very cynical about human nature. So he kind of balances idealism with cynicism. And it really comes out in his History of the World, his, 1 million word book. It's 1,400, almost 1,500 pages. And a lot of it is about morality and the immorality of governments. In fact, he writes this great poem. It's one of my favorite poems by him. It's called The Lie. And it's about how corrupt all institutions are. The church is corrupt. Universities are corrupt. Governments are corrupt. Everything's corrupt. He says, I'm even corrupt, So I think he's, the typical idealist that's hoping for the best, but he is cynical. He is skeptical about human nature.
Sure. Say one last thing about Ireland. Did Raleigh really introduce the potato?
I think he did. I make the case for the book that the rumors are true. First of all, the potatoes, we know they came from North America, that they came from Virginia, that Thomas Harriot brought them back. The potatoes that already were in Europe were Spanish potato that the Spanish had brought back from South America, and those are not going to become the famous potatoes that develop in Europe. It is the the Virginia potato, basically. And he was planting and experimenting right at his home in Youghal, on the coast there of Ireland. He experimented with all kinds of things. Thomas Harriot was with him, and they were experimenting with all kinds of fruits. In fact, we even have an inventory of things that his brother sent over for him to plant. And this is where the potato took off in Ireland, right on the border of the two counties that his properties abut. And it's on, so that's where it all starts. It's right outside where he lives. It's on, his lands, the lands he owns. And I think the reason it caught on, because the Irish didn't like the potato at first, was because of the military situation. When the English had come in the Desmond Wars before Raleigh's colonizing, but he was involved in the Second Desmond War, the typical English strategy, which they're going to use again in future wars, was to cut down Irish wheat fields, to try to starve people into submission. In fact, it was Raleigh's brother who recommended this years before. And so the wheat was tall and soldiers could see the fields, and they'd go in and just destroy them. They'd burn the fields. Well, the potato fields are short. You don't see them so easily. The potatoes are underground. So it's hard to destroy the crop, even if you're burning, the tops of the plants. And the priests, we have evidence of local priests telling Irish, do these potatoes. They're good. They don't, this will be good for us. And the potatoes do take off and become, so associated with Ireland, of course.
All right. Okay. So we've got this Renaissance man who is interested in all sorts of things. He's colonizing in Roanoke in North America. He's establishing, he's colonizing in Ireland. Where in the world does El Dorado come in? We're in a whole nother region. How does that happen?
What's so fantastic about this is he's in London and he's sending the the second ex the second expedition to, excuse me, the third expedition to Roanoke, while he's planning to move to Ireland to colonize. As soon as he sends the expedition, he's off to Ireland. And at the same time, he gets interested in El Dorado. To make a long story short, there was a Spanish prisoner that Raleigh saves from being tortured, basically. And he treats him really well. They get along great. They have a lot in common, which I go into in the book. And this guy tells him all about the Spanish search for El Dorado. And Raleigh gets the bug for it. And, he's a doer. So immediately he puts together an expedition. Because of the threat to England, he doesn't have a ship to spare to take them to South America. So he writes to the French and asks them to do it, and to take an Italian captain he's got in England who knows where to go, which is to Trinidad, and to the mainland across Trinidad in what's today Venezuela and Guyana. And he gives the Italian captain 4 boys, English boys, and a whole bunch of goods to take to give to the Indians. So he wants these 4 boys to be planted with Indians, 2 in Trinidad, this big island, and 2 on the coast of the Orinoco River, so they can learn the local languages. So when he comes to look for El Dorado, because he thinks he knows how to get there and find it, he'll have these kids, how kids are with languages, they'll have learned the language really quickly. Unfortunately, he didn't come back for 10 years. So we don't know what happened to 3 of the boys, and we have some record of the 4th. But it does become common. In fact, Raleigh's going to leave 2 young men later on when he does get to El Dorado. And by the way, this becomes very common in America, to leave children with Indians so they learn the languages, so they can become interpreters. Now, the French especially like doing this. They do it in Louisiana, for instance, throughout the Louisiana area. They do it in Illinois. So they would have done it up near Michigan as well, with the fox, for instance, and the Sauk, and so on. Anyway, it's not until he becomes persona non grata in England that he decides, oh, it's time to go to El Dorado. And go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, you've talked a little bit already about his time in prison, and you just mentioned he's going to become persona non grata. He had this really close relationship with the Queen, for 10, 12 years, something like that. What happens? How does that turn?
Well, he fell in love with someone else. He fell in love with one of the Queen's lady-in-waitings, Elizabeth Throckmorton, called Bess, although it's funny because the Queen's also called Bess by people. And she got mad when he got her pregnant and put him under house arrest, and her too. She wasn't irreconcilable to this. Men will be men was her view. And in fact, she completed, after he was under house arrest, the transfer to him of his great estate. She had promised him this wonderful estate as a reward. So she was still giving him the estate, and she did give it to him. But then she found out he had married Bess secretly. And she was so mad because, first of all, her lady-in-waitings were not allowed to marry without the Queen's permission. And so she threw them both in prison, not jail, but prison. Bess was barred from ever coming back to court again. And she's an elite. She's barred. She can't come back. But she got the prize she wanted, Raleigh. And Raleigh was imprisoned for some months until she needed him, and he was released from prison to settle something. But he was still barred from coming back to court. She didn't deprive him of all his monopolies. So he's still rich because he's got a lot of followers. She doesn't want to hurt his followers, basically. Because that could be disastrous. You could have a civil war if you remove someone at top without taking care of their people. So she got a lot of sympathy because she didn't punish his people. And ultimately, he was able to buy his way basically out of prison with her, and he then had to prove himself otherwise to get back in her good graces. And he did a bunch of things, including she fell for another young man, the Earl of Essex, and Essex had bad relations with some of the other men at court, and Raleigh became the go-between. He's the mediator, between groups at court, and she sent him on military expeditions with the Earl of Essex, so to keep him in line, because she's worried about that young man. And it's then that he becomes the hero of Cadiz. He's involved in other activities, but we saw the early picture where he has and it's after he is wounded basically that her heart begins to soften to him, and soon he's allowed back at court and to resume his duties as captain of the guard. He's always been captain of the guard, which means he's personally responsible for her health and safety. But he wasn't allowed to be at court to do his duties. He still chose who gets to do it. So he gets back in her good graces. But while he was not in her good graces, he went to El Dorado. And he will write a book about El Dorado, which becomes very famous. He wrote the book to get English people to invest in the enterprise so he could go back, because his first trip he didn't find the mines. He knows where they are, but he needed more power to take them, he believed. And the Indians are going to help him. They promised to help him because they're against the Spanish. And he had healed things with the Spanish. He put some Spanish to death who had enslaved the local Indians. So he gets a reputation there as a friend to the Indians. And so he writes the book. But anyway, that's the El Dorado. He does go back again.
Well, I was going to ask a little bit about that, because one of the chapter titles, and I really like the chapter titles, is Wheel of Fortune. As he's always, he's got this up-down relationship with the Queen, and then he gets back in her good graces. But then the Queen dies. And,
1603.
Right. And so what happens when there's when James assumes the throne?
King James, he's a Scot. Most of the English have not ever met him. And he inherits the throne. He moves to England. Raleigh's, the top guy, or number two, depending on who you're looking at. And James takes one look at Raleigh and he hates him. And they were just so different personality-wise. They had such different interests. Raleigh sees a very large world. King James is very narrow-minded. He was called the wisest fool in Christendom. He was very learned, but he couldn't see the forest from the trees. And so there are a lot of people jealous of Raleigh, and he is put into prison on trumped-up charges of treason, that he's going to kill the king and his children. And the king says, even though he's supposed to be put to death, he says he can keep his life in the Tower of London. And he winds up being there for over 10 years. He has a defender, though, the Queen. King James's wife, Queen Anne, was cured by one of Raleigh's medicines. She thinks he's wonderful. She will send to the prison her son, Prince Henry, the heir apparent, to learn how to be a man from Raleigh.
Aww.
And Raleigh writes all kinds of pamphlets specifically for the prince, but also for the king. He's trying to get himself back into the king's good graces by giving the king all this advice through publications. And the son convinces his father to release Raleigh from prison at Christmas. The father actually buys back Raleigh's great estate, which he had taken and sold to his new favorite, the Duke of Buckingham. He buys back the estate. Raleigh's going to be out in just months, because he's going to be freed at Christmas time. And I'm pretty sure this all happened because I have enough evidence of it. Prince Henry gets sick with typhus. And there's like dozens of physicians trying to heal them. They all give up. And so the king's men turn to Raleigh, you're our last hope. And could you make one of your medicines for him? And he says, basically, he's too far gone, but I'll try. The prince does die. And from the king's perspective, who's Raleigh? And he doesn't free him. He sells back to Buckingham, basically the estate that was Raleigh's. And Raleigh's back in prison for years. And he finally gets out when he convinces James, I really do know where El Dorado is. Let me out. I'll make you the richest man in Christendom. And James falls for it and lets Raleigh out. And Raleigh takes about a year preparing. And he gets there and he fails. He's sick. He doesn't get off the ship. His son dies in a raid on the Spanish. And he comes home and the king takes his life, to make a long story short.
Well, I'd like to get to that, do I dare say the end? But before we get could you talk a little bit more about his interest in alchemy and science and religion and how they were very much compatible and in
Sure.
his mind in particular and with many of his contemporaries?
Yeah, alchemy, which is, gives birth to chemistry. In fact, the father of chemistry looks at Raleigh as being, just a great chemist and writes a lot about Raleigh, which is kind of interesting. Robert Boyle, who's famous for Boyle's Law, and actually lived in one of Raleigh's castles in Ireland as a boy, grew up there. Anyway, alchemy was, we think of it as turning lead into gold, but it is supposed to be the transformation of one substance into another by adding substances together. So that's why it's chemistry. And what the alchemist does, like a chemist will then do, is they measure quantities, they do tests, they record their experiments. A lot of this is for healing. That's Raleigh's real interest, is healing. Other people have different kinds of interests, but he is a specialist on metals. He's very good with metals, and he's doing experiments in the Tower of London. The Queen gets him a laboratory that he has 24-hour access to as a prisoner all those years. And people come from all over Europe to get his famous cordials. And some of them are cure-alls, they're panaceas, but there's others as well. They're used in the United States till the early 20th century. The pharmaceutical industry is developed and led by the Rockefellers, and it does away, they get this kind of medicine outlawed. And although it continues in England really to the present day, they don't have the same laws against the kinds of medicines that Raleigh was producing. They're very complicated. Raleigh's cordial, there was a whole book written in the 1660s in French and English by the king's chemist in England, studying Raleigh's cordial. And it's phenomenally detailed in recreating the experiments, because we have what they called the recipes. The word recipe, by the way, comes from medicines, not from food. It comes from how to put together a medicine. But anyway, so Raleigh, the alchemist, is interested in hard things. And they believe the study of physical things, every physical thing has a reason for existence. God has created everything. And humans can't understand God, but if they understand the physical universe, they'll understand God's plan. Why did he create a mosquito? Why did he create gold or silver? Why did he create birds? Why did he create the stars? So these scientists, these are the first modern scientists. They're very interested in physics. Thomas Harriot, who we talked about, was the most important theorist about the atom, that physical things have invisible things in them. They were called the atom. He's theorizing about it. And it's at this time they're theorizing about gravity. You can't see gravity. They're theorizing about the things you can't see. And they think that alchemy is going to help them identify how does gravity work. They know what it is. They know that medicines work inside the body. You can't see the medicine, but it works. So they're very interested in figuring out what works with medicines, what works in the physical world. And then you try to figure out its meaning. It brings you closer to God. So that's where alchemy and God go together. And he would say, oh, if I give you one more quick example from the Bible, the Magi. Right? Which, by the way, King James had taken out of the King James version of the Bible. He didn't want people to think magicians. Magicians didn't mean like it does today. It means people who manipulate physical substances. And so he changed the three magi to the three wise men. So this is what, and Raleigh writes about these things in his History of the World while he's in prison. He writes this massively popular history, and he talks a lot about alchemy and magic. Again, magic in the way I mean, as someone who's trying to get closer to God. He believes magicians are the most, pious people.
So we don't have a lot of time left, but could you maybe address his execution and death?
Yes.
Let us know what ended up happening.
And it is quite a scene. So that's going to be after his third trip to the prison, when he gets back from El Dorado and he's failed. He expects to have a trial. The king's not going to let him have a trial again because the last one was such a farce and it was mocked. It made Raleigh a great hero. He went from being hated to the greatest hero in England because it was seen that it was so unjust that he was convicted of treason when they didn't have two witnesses, and the one witness they had took it back. And they never let Raleigh cross-examine the witness. Said, we can't do that. You'll just, secrets will get out. You'll fool him. You'll trick him. So he never showed up in court. The one witness never showed up in court. So they decided they wouldn't have a trial and that he would lose his head. The king decided this from the original death sentence from now 15 years earlier. And so he prepared for his death. He actually rewrote a poem we have that he wrote the night before his death, which is quite touching. He did spend a lot of time thinking about death. He wrote other poems about death. And it's quite a scene. We have many people who wrote about the scene. He gave a 45-minute speech. But and he went bravely, because the Earl of Essex didn't go bravely. He wanted to make sure he went bravely. He took off his cap and gave it to an elderly man who was standing around, because I won't need this anymore, but you will. He was cutting jokes. And so it's a great scene, and he rises to the occasion. So his legend sort of lives on. But I just want to add one thing in, and that is the witnesses to the scene. This was very powerful for them. And several of the fellows who are going to become radicals in England in the 1630s and behead King Charles I, the son of this king, King James II. It's when they watch Raleigh getting beheaded, and he's this innocent man in their eyes, that they say that's what woke them up to Stuart tyranny, the tyranny of monarchs. And if you read Raleigh's History of the World, a good part of it is really about how evil kings are. So there's now a Bible of anti-monarchalism in England that he's created while he was in prison. It becomes the most popular history written by an Englishman in the 17th century. And it's very popular still in the 18th century. It goes through many editions, abridgments. It makes him huge. He's more popularly read than Shakespeare for a good part of the 17th century. He sells much more. Shakespeare, catches up and passes Raleigh, but through much of the 17th century, after Shakespeare's plays are published, Raleigh is still the most popular writer of his time. So, a lot of people read his work, were influenced by him.
Well, he's a Renaissance man, he's a colonist, he's a chemist, he's a warrior, he's a pirate.
Arg!
The book
Ah, good
is
book.
Walter Raleigh, Architect of Empire, published by Basic Books. I'm sure you can get it anywhere online. You can get it at a local bookstore, buy local, maybe. You could do that. You could get that. But we've had a wonderful conversation this evening with Dr. Alan Gallay from Texas Christian University. I don't notice any questions here as we wrap up, but I just want to say, wow. This has been a lot of fun. It's been great to hear so much and to hear from you. Again, I just want to hold up the book because it's a great looking book. It's Sir Walter Raleigh, Architect of Empire, and Basic Books. If you'd like to pick up a copy. So
Thank you so much. This was a pleasure for me. I enjoyed talking with you all. And have best of luck with the program this year. Sounds like you got a great program developing.
yeah, really appreciate it, and it's because we have speakers like you who can come in with a level of expertise to really contribute to our community. So thank you. All right, and thank you everyone who was here with us tonight. We really appreciate it, and take care and enjoy the rest of your evening. All right.
Thanks. Good night.
All right.